Welcome to video 2 of your free video series. In this video we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty. We're going to cover the 8 main things you need to know when starting out on this Ayurvedic food and lifestyle journey. You're learning all about Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking and the key things you need to know to understand it. So the problem is, as we talked about in the last video, that when it comes to knowing what to eat to be healthy, it's very confusing out there. There are so many different dietary approaches and they seem to be coming out every few weeks. There's a different one that becomes popular and a lot of them have really conflicting advice. So it's very, very confusing. Plus, people are really enthusiastic about these different diets. You always find people who've had so much success on them and they swear by them and they have a fabulous experience, but then other people don't. So some things suit some people, but they don't suit other people. So how do we work out what's right for us? Now, the wonderful thing about Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking is it has a very in-depth understanding of why everyone's a little bit different and why some things work for some people and other things work for other people. And that's through the Ayurvedic understanding of constitution, also known as prakriti, or you may have heard of it as body type. So as a result, when people are starting out on this journey, that's the first thing they read about. That's often the first thing that most books talk about, because it's a really important concept, because it really helps us understand our individuality, why we are the way we are, and why our physical and mental tendencies, especially our digestive tendencies, are the way they are. So it's a wonderfully empowering tool. However, the problem with it when it comes to Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking is it can become way too complicated way too quickly. You may have had this experience already where you've tried to fill out a constitution chart and work out what your constitution is, and you've probably heard the words Vata, Pitta and Kapha. So you've worked out, oh, maybe I'm Vata or Pitta or Vata Pitta, which can be a combination of two. But then everyone in the family seems to have a different constitution. And then you look at the food charts where a Vata person should favour these foods and avoid these foods, and a Pitta person should favour these foods and avoid these foods. But a lot of the foods cross over. So if you're Vata Pitta, one line might say you should be favouring a food, but in the Pitta column you should be avoiding it. So it becomes very complicated and incredibly confusing, and to be frank, it's utterly unnecessary when you're starting out, and it will put you off really quickly and it will not make this approach sustainable. So in this video we will not be talking about Vata, Pitta and Kapha and food charts, because the best way to start out with Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking is to consider Agni, to look at your digestive fire, because the qualities that help to support a balanced digestive fire won't actually put your constitution out of balance. They will help bring it into balance. So it's far preferable to follow a Agni focused approach to eating than it is to focus on the doshas or the prakriti. All these words, if you haven't heard them yet, don't worry about them, because I don't want you to worry about them yet, okay? Only worry about your Agni. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the 8 steps for making Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking easy? We'll go through them one by one. So the first one, step 1, that we need to consider is the quality of our food. For me, this step was actually quite a big deal, because I used to be so into processed food, like going for a low calorie, low fat diet. When you don't know how to cook, you are eating a lot of processed food. That's what I lived on. So this was a big step for me, moving from highly processed food to whole foods, food that is as close to off the tree, out of the ground and out of the cow as possible. This is what we mean by the quality of our food. We want to start moving towards eating predominantly unprocessed food that we cook ourselves or are cooked by other people with love. Now, this is so important from an Ayurvedic perspective, because when Ayurveda first was developed thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, all food was like this. There was no such thing as processed food. This is the absolute base starting point of Ayurveda. There also weren't any refrigerators around at the time, so Ayurveda is really, really big on not eating stale food and eating food fresh. Obviously, now that we have the technology of refrigerators, we can stretch this out a little bit. We don't have to be hardcore about not eating stale food. We can eat leftovers from time to time. That's absolutely fine and absolutely necessary, because we don't want to waste our food. But it does mean that we don't want to be eating stale food off of supermarket shelves. This is food that's been pre-prepared and has potentially sat around for weeks, if not months, before it's actually consumed. And it's had all sorts of extra chemicals and additives put into it to maintain a long shelf life. So we're wanting to generally avoid long shelf life foods, unless they're prepared in more of a traditional way, like chutneys or sauerkrauts or fermented foods and that sort of thing, that are prepared in a really traditional way to have a long shelf life, if that makes sense. So we're wanting to avoid heavily processed food with long lists of ingredients that we don't recognize. This is step one, the quality of our food. So as part of this step, it means that you're going to want to be shopping in a slightly different way. You might not want to be spending all of your time at the supermarket. You might want to move towards shopping at whole food stores instead. And you can buy your ingredients in beautiful brown bags, take them home and pop them into jars. So if you see my kitchen up here, we have all jars just full of whole foods that we can cook from scratch. And it's really inspiring to have them out on display, because you can see what's available and it helps encourage you to cook them, because they're so colourful and beautiful and exciting. So that's a wonderful thing to do as you're starting to cook with more whole foods. You can also get all of your kitchen spices from whole food stores and buy them organic. Again, buy them in little baggies and put them into jars. Again, down here you can see, oh, there we are. You can see our spice jars. So we keep them all in jars out on display, and it just fills the kitchen with warmth and really inspires you to get cooking. So what's step two? Step two is eating predominantly warm foods. Now we're moving into the quality of food, not so much as the quality of food that we talked about in the first step, but the qualities of food. So the qualities of warm, light and slightly oily. How we introduce these qualities into our organism in order to increase them in our organism, in order to encourage a balanced digestive fire. So what do we do to warm up our food? This is really simple. We cook it, and we cook it with spices, because generally spices can be quite warming, but most importantly, all kitchen spices have an effect on the digestive fire. They have an enkindling effect on the digestive fire. So you have some spices that are warming, you have some that are neutral, and you have some that are actually cooling, but all of them have an enkindling effect on the digestion. And that is why they became kitchen spices in the first place. Now, it's not exclusively spices, it's also herbs. So we're talking coriander, basil, tarragon, oregano. All of these beautiful plants have an enkindling effect on the digestive fire. So if we're using them in our cooking day in, day out, it has like a compounding medicinal effect on our digestion. And it makes our food taste absolutely amazing. This is a critical step in our cooking journey, and it's also a wonderful thing, because often when people are starting out in Ayurveda, they have the misconception that all of the food has to be Indian, and it absolutely doesn't, because all traditional cuisines have their own array of spices and herbs that they use in their cooking. And it's these beautiful ingredients combined with cooking whole foods from scratch, cook with love, that makes the foods much easier to digest. So in addition to predominantly eating warm food, we also want to be avoiding excessively heating food. So we don't want hot food, we just want warm food. If our food is too hot, then that's going to create that sharp digestive fire, that excessive heat. It's going to aggravate the fire element in the body. So we want to avoid excessively heating foods, especially chili, not too much chili. There are other foods that are also quite heating, like tomatoes, which we tend to eat a huge amount in a Western diet, specifically processed tomatoes like tomato paste or tomato sauces that are really quite intense. If you're just using a fresh tomato here and there in a meal, that's absolutely fine. But eating lots and lots of processed tomato, that can be very heating. Seafood's also quite heating. Peanut butter's also quite heating. So just being aware of not excessively eating heating foods all the time. We also want to be avoiding excessively cold foods because these have a real dampening effect on the digestive fire and will definitely encourage either that variable digestive fire or the dull digestive fire. So we want to avoid excessively cold food and drinks. We're talking ice cream specifically, and drinks with ice in it, which of course are served all the time. So instead of having cold drinks all the time, you want to either have room temperature drinks, or preferably, one of the best things you can do for your digestive fire is to drink warm drinks. So herbal teas, hot water. Just try drinking hot water or herbal teas all the way through the day instead of drinking ice cold water. It'll make a huge difference to your digestive fire. Let's move on to step 3. So the next step is light foods, favouring light foods. Now what are light foods? They are fruits, vegetables, different legumes and pulses and certain grains. So there's a vast array of light foods that we want to favour, but we also want to avoid excessively heavy foods. Or rather, when we do eat heavy foods from time to time, we want to prepare them in a way that makes them lighter. Now, some of the heavy foods you'll be very familiar with that are difficult to digest are milk, dairy products, and gluten and wheat products, and meat. All of these are very heavy and difficult to digest, and that's one of the main reasons why wheat and dairy have become such a huge issue in the dietary landscape, and why people often give them up and eliminate them from their diets. However, you don't necessarily need to do this unless you have a genuine allergy to wheat or dairy. You can simply eat them less often and prepare them in a way that makes them much, much lighter and easier to digest. So, for example, when it comes to wheat, wheat is a very heavy, sticky, difficult to digest grain. It's very cold, and we tend to combine it with yeast, which makes it even more heavy and sticky and difficult to digest. So eating bread all the time is not a great idea for your digestive fire. If you are going to eat bread, one way to make it lighter and easier to digest is to toast it. Sourdoughs tend to be a little bit lighter than other breads, but preferably you want to get breads that don't have any yeast in them at all. So that might be flatbreads or making your own chapatis. Another way we can make our wheat lighter is, for example, if you have semolina, which is a little bit like couscous, but it's even smaller, and we can cook it up into a porridge. What we do in that example with Ayurvedic cooking is we roast the semolina on a dry pan for quite some time to get as much moisture and heaviness out of the grain as possible before we add our other ingredients. So we toast the semolina, then we add a little bit of ghee to it, which is actually a really light fat, but we'll talk about that in the next step. And that actually makes the wheat lighter and also slows down the absorption of the carbohydrate into the bloodstream. And then we add our other ingredients. We add some hot water and turn it into a really light, fluffy, but still very satisfying porridge. So there are different cooking techniques you use in Ayurveda to make heavier food lighter. In the case of meat, for example, we all know there's a huge difference between eating a chicken parmigiana at the pub or eating a chicken soup. Which one's lighter in our bellies, do you think? Chicken soup, of course. So cooking meat as a soup is really the best way to eat meat because it makes it much, much lighter and easier to digest and more bioavailable and much more nutritious and much more soothing to the organism. If you want something a little bit heavier than a soup but still want to cook your meat really well, you can slow cook it as a casserole or as a curry, and that's another fantastic way to consume meat. Or just really slow cooked meat generally. If you're going to have a roast or something like that, cooking it in a slow cooker is the best possible way to do it, or cooking it in an oven at a low temperature for hours and hours. That is the ideal way to consume meat. So meat is really, you can think of it as a medicine. It's not something you should be having all the time necessarily because it does put a strain on your digestive fire, but having it from time to time and cooked in a way that makes it lighter and easier to digest is best. What we can do, the art form of Ayurvedic cooking, is bringing our heavy foods and our light foods together and using our light foods to really lighten up our heavy foods. Also, just adding water to a dish will make it much, much lighter. So rather than having a slab of chicken and just grilling it, cooking it as a casserole with vegetables and maybe some legumes and water, it completely changes the quality of the food. So start to think in this way, adding spices. Spices are amazing for helping the digestion of these heavier foods. So the light foods we mentioned before, fruits, vegetables, certain legumes, certain grains. So most fruits are incredibly light. So a very important tip in Ayurveda is to eat your fresh fruit separately from other foods because it's so light. If you combine it with any other food, if you eat it with any other heavier food, it will tend to stay in the stomach for too long because our food bolus in the stomach after we've eaten will stay in the stomach for as long as the heaviest food it takes to digest. So if you have really light fruit in there, it will tend to stay in the stomach too long and it will overcook, it will ferment and it will become armour. So it's best to eat our fresh fruit separately. Dried fruit, cooked fruit are a slightly different story, but fresh fruit we should eat separately. So that's a hot tip. Vegetables. We all know which vegetables are heavier than other vegetables. Obviously root vegetables are a bit heavier than leafy greens. So, we can bring this knowledge that we already have into our cooking. If we want to have something that's a little bit lighter, then we might aim for more leafy greens. If we will need something a little bit heavier and more satisfying because we've got that stronger digestive fire, then we can incorporate more root vegetables. It's an art form. In terms of legumes that are particularly easy to digest and good to eat and are inclined to not cause as many digestive issues as some legumes can, split mung dal is a fabulous legume. Red lentils are very easy to digest and very easy to cook and don't form much gas. Chickpeas have to be cooked fresh. You need to soak them and cook them in a pressure cooker. That's the best way to consume chickpeas. If you're going to have chickpeas from a can, they're going to cause gas. If you're okay with that and you just accept that, that's fine. If you know you're just going to be gassy after eating your canned chickpeas, have your canned chickpeas. But the best way to eat chickpeas is to soak them overnight, cook them in a pressure cooker until they're really soft, until you can easily squish them between your fingers. Poi lentils, which are French green lentils, are also very easy to cook and quite easy to digest. You don't have to soak them overnight. So they are really my favourite legumes. Also, adzuki beans are really, really lovely. Again, you have to soak them overnight and it's best to cook them in a pressure cooker until you can squish them between your fingers. And if you have all of those legumes and you particularly cook them with a substance, a herb called asafoetida or hing, that can really help to reduce any gas forming qualities of the legumes. So there's another hot tip. Grains. The lightest grains tend to be rice, quinoa, buckwheat, millet and amaranth. Now, I don't eat those other grains a great deal. I tend to eat a lot of rice. I have a little bit of buckwheat, and I occasionally cook with millet. And I don't really like quinoa. I don't like the taste of it, and I know that there are, social inequality issues from the popularity of quinoa, so I tend not to buy it, and I don't tend to buy amaranth either. But just know that there are a massive variety of grains out there in the world. You do not need to be eating wheat all of the time. We massively over consume wheat. So start trying out different rices. Like, we regularly have white basmati rice, red basmati rice, brown rice, short grain rice, white short grain rice, all different rices, and they go with all different meals. We also have polenta, we have couscous, we have semolina, and we mix it up all the time. So we don't eat a lot of bread, and we don't have a huge amount of wheat. And that means when you do have wheat, you have it on the days where you feel like you need something a little bit heavier and more substantial. Like if we've gone surfing in the morning, we might have a wheat pasta for lunch, and that's totally fine because our digestive fires are strong from some strong exercise. So that's a really good way to consider things. It's also important to not mix too many heavy foods together. For example, when we do have pasta, it's really common when you have pasta to have lots of heavies together. You might have pasta, you might have a meat sauce on top of it, you might put cheese on top of that, you might have nuts on top of that. It's just heavy upon heavy upon heavy. And it just sits in your belly because you've just tripled down on the heavy foods. So if you know you're going to have something heavy like pasta, have a lighter sauce with it. So for example, we have a lovely pasta in our warmth cookbook that is just very finely chopped fennel, very finely chopped onion, and very finely chopped zucchini with a couple of garlic cloves and some oregano. It's so easy, so simple, cooks so quickly, but it's a really beautiful light sauce to have on the pasta. And it sits really well in your belly because you haven't eaten heavy and heavy and heavy and heavy. You've just had heavy with a bit of light. You see? The other thing to mention is that when foods are cooked together in a pot, in a one-pot meal, they combine much better than if you're just eating lots of things separately. So having a casserole or a dal or a curry is a wonderful way to eat foods because it helps the foods to get along together. They spend time in a pot and they share each other's qualities. So you might have a mixture of heavy foods, but then you have some light foods, then you have some spices, and they all cook together for half an hour, 2 hours, depending on what you're making. And that creation is a completely different food compared to if you were eating all of those same ingredients separately in different piles, if that makes sense. It's like an integration of qualities that then meet your digestive fire. They're already pre-cooked in a way so that all of the nutrients are more bioavailable and easier for your body to digest and assimilate and absorb. So one-pot meals are awesome. Step number 4, slightly oily. Now this was a big deal for me because I was such a low-fat, no-fat kind of girl that starting to incorporate some fats into my diet was a big deal. I think we're at the stage in Western nutrition science where fats, even saturated fats, are far more accepted as healthy. So it's not such a big deal to incorporate slightly oily food into your diet unless maybe you grew up in the 70s or 80s. You might still not have gotten over that. But from personal experience, I can very happily report that it is a wonderful thing to include more oil into your diet. Now, I'm not talking a huge amount of oil that we get to the point where the oil becomes heavy. Slightly oily, where the food is just slightly unctuous, maybe a tablespoon of oil or 2 tablespoons of oil, depending on what you're making. Some meals need more because you're cooking with ingredients that are more astringent and more drying. For example, when you're cooking eggplants are really astringent vegetable. It soaks up oil in seconds. Onions are quite astringent. They soak up oil really quickly. So sometimes when you're cooking with those ingredients, you need to use a little bit more oil, and it actually balances out the dryness of the foods. And you get to know that as you cook more. But a little bit of oil enkindles the digestive fire. And the best oil of all from an Ayurvedic perspective is ghee, which is clarified butter. I won't go on about it, but basically ghee has the very special quality, of enkindling the digestive fire. It's sweet and it's cooling, so normally you would expect ghee wouldn't enkindle the digestive fire because it has an opposing quality to the digestive fire. It's cooling and it's sweet. But it has a special quality in Ayurveda of enkindling the digestive fire. I think I've said that enough times now. You get it. So it's specifically for that. It's actually used enormously in Ayurveda as a carrier of medicines, because it helps the body to digest the medicines, assimilate them and absorb them. And it's also an incredibly subtle oil because it's made from very short chain fatty acids that the body finds incredibly easy to digest, and therefore they can be absorbed at a very deep level in the body. They don't have to go through the full process of fat digestion in order to be absorbed in the body. So ghee is a very subtle, light, easy to digest oil, and it's also incredibly stable for cooking. So you can cook at a very high temperatures without it being damaged in any way, unlike a lot of other oils. So other oils that we cook with all the time are olive oil. Personally, I mainly use olive oil and ghee, but I also use sesame oil. If I'm, for example, cooking a more Asian dish, I'll use coconut oil if I'm making more of a Sri Lankan dish. So I tend to choose my oils based on my cultural cuisine and the tendency of the oils that they use in that culture. But ghee and olive oil are definite staples. When you're buying your olive oil, get very good quality extra virgin olive oil. And you can actually, the science is out now, you can actually cook that at a high heat and it's okay. So previously it was said that you couldn't cook olive oil at a high heat, but it's since been discovered that if it's a really good quality cold pressed extra virgin olive oil, it's fine at high heats, no problem. So there we have it. In addition to eating slightly oily food, we want to be avoiding food that is too dry, really drying foods. So the real obvious dry foods are things like cereal, rice cakes, crackers, and baked goods are often very drying, so muffins and that sort of thing, which you know when you eat them they kind of dry out your mouth a little bit. A lot of those things are also highly processed, so we want to tend to be avoiding them too much anyway. So not too much dry food. If you are going to have a dry food like a cracker or a rice cracker, make sure you just put a generous amount of butter on it or ghee, and that will help to antidote the dry qualities a little bit. But generally we want to be avoiding these highly processed, very dry foods. We also want to be avoiding too much raw food and too many salads, because both of these things are also dry and they're also rough. So over time they have an effect on the digestive fire. They are cold, dry and rough. So they're kind of the opposite qualities to a balanced digestive fire. And although they might lead to weight loss in the short term, in the long term they'll lead to weight gain because they will affect the quality of the digestive fire. It will become variable and we'll get armour accumulating and so on and so forth. And finally, we want to avoid foods that are too oily, like deep fried foods, because then we've moved into the heavy category. We all know how it feels when you eat fish and chips. You're not sitting there afterwards thinking, oh, I just had something that was light and slightly oily and it feels lovely in my belly and I feel so light and energetic. No, when we eat fish and chips afterwards, we're like, oh, that was amazing, but oh, I feel sick. This is the best way to determine whether something is good for your digestive fire or whether it's not so good for a balanced digestive fire is how you feel after you've eaten it. If you feel like this, not so good. If you feel like this, that's good. That's the end of the video series. That's all you need to know. So we've covered the first 4 steps. We are down with the quality of our food. Now let's look at the next 3 aspects, and I'll go through them quite quickly because I don't want to keep you too much longer. So the next step, step number 5, is the quantity of our food. A lot of us tend to just slightly overeat at every single meal. It's like we want to get to the point where we feel full to make sure we've had enough. And as a result, because the message between being full and getting to our brain can be a little bit slower than the rate at which we eat, we tend to overeat, even just a little bit, at a lot of meals. Maybe not every meal, but at least 1 meal a day. It's really, really common, this insidious overeating. Now this puts a huge strain on our digestive fire. It's actually so much better to slightly undereat and not feel completely full at the end of a meal than it is to slightly overeat. So just play around with that a little bit. I don't want you to undereat all the time, particularly if you are underweight, but just undereating a little bit might actually help your digestion to digest more of the food than you've just eaten than if you slightly overeat all the time. And all of your tissues will be better nourished in a more appropriate way than if you're constantly overeating and your digestive fire isn't working properly. So keep that in mind. In Ayurveda they say cup your 2 hands together. So do that right for me right now. Have a look at the size of that. That is about the size, the amount of food that you should be eating. Particularly if your main meal, you don't really want to be eating much more than that. Obviously if you're having a light meal that's got a lot of water in it and a lot of light foods, you can eat more. If you're eating a really heavy meal, it's like French cuisine. Everything's really heavy, but they eat it in very tiny amounts, so they're all over it. They know what they're doing. So if you're having a very heavy meal, you don't want to have much more than that. So that doesn't look like a lot, does it? It's a really good idea to get a bowl that's about that size and just start experimenting with it. Eat that amount of food for a certain type of food, see whether it's enough. If it's not, you go back for seconds and just have a little bit more. But it really helps you control your quantity intake. Also in Ayurveda they say your stomach should be about half full of food, a quarter full of liquid, and have a quarter of the stomach free for churning. This is why we don't want to overeat. You imagine the stomach as a balloon that pulses and churns to mix all the food and the digestive juices together. If that is too full, it's not going to be able to mix everything properly. It's like when you try to cook in a pot that's too small and you're stirring it and just stuff's falling out and not cooking properly because only the very base of it is in contact with the heat, and it's just frustrating. It's like trying to dance in a telephone booth. It's just not okay. Same with your stomach. Leave room for your food to dance in your stomach. That's all I'll say. So next, let's talk about timing. Timing is a really big deal in Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking. First of all, we want to consider our routine. We want to get into a routine with our eating. We want to eat at a similar time each day if we can, because we can think of our digestive fire as kind of like a dog that gets used to eating at a certain time and starts to salivate when it's ready for food. If it expects food at a certain time, the digestive juices will start to flow. This is particularly important if we have to eat out a bit, like if we work in the city and we're eating out during the day and we don't have time to prepare the body for food. When we're cooking at home, we have beautiful smells and aromas, and we start to get hungry as we're cooking because we're being prepared by the environment. But when we go out to eat, suddenly we're there and boom, the food's in front of us, we're shoveling it down, and our body hasn't even had time to come to terms with the fact that it's about to eat. But if we're eating at a similar time each day, the body will expect food at that time, and our digestive fire will naturally be stronger. Our appetite will naturally be better. So that's a wonderful thing to do. It also helps to pacify the winds in the body that when they are out of routine tend to create that variable Agni. So routine in our food timing is very important. I'm not saying it has to be down to the minute, but just within about a half an hour to an hour window each day is a really good thing to do for your digestive fire. An amazing thing to do for your digestive fire. The second amazing thing in terms of timing that you can do is to eat your heaviest meal in the middle of the day. Now, it doesn't have to be your biggest meal, but just your heaviest meal. So often those two things do go together. You'll have your main meal in the middle of the day, and that will be your heaviest meal. But for example, if you're eating meat, the best time, or other heavy foods like cheese or wheat, that sort of thing, the best time to be eating heavy foods is in the middle of the day, because that's when our digestive fire is at its strongest, because that's when the reflection of our digestive fire in the environment, the sun, is highest in the sky. So that has an effect on our digestive fire. It increases our digestive fire. It's also the middle of the day when we've been doing things, we've created a bit of an appetite. We might not tend to have an appetite in the morning. It might be very low because we've been sleeping. In the middle of the day, our appetite is generally good. So that's when we should have our heaviest meal, and preferably our main meal of the day. I know this is really not in line with our culture whatsoever, but if you can change the culture in your household, do it. If you have kids and you want to have a main meal together at the end of the day, there's a great book by Dr. John Douillard called Perfect Health for Kids. Now, he has, I think, 5 or 6 kids, so he's all over it. It's a good book to read. But I think how they manage it in their family is they're like, well, you know what, kids don't really eat very well when they're at school anyway, because they're running around, they're distracted, so we'll just give them some really grounding snacks to eat for reception and lunch, and when they're really hungry is when they get home and they start to settle down a little bit. So we sit down with them when they get home and they eat their main meal at that time, which really grounds them and centers them. They can do their homework, they've got stable blood sugar, and then we can have a light supper together, like a really light soup. When we're having our light meal at the end of the day, we can have a light meal together, and that's how they manage it. And then they can have their main meal in the middle of the day at lunchtime. So that's a way you can do it with your kids, which I think is pretty clever. Next. So now we're up to step number 7. Now, step number 7 is environment. One of the things that disturbs our digestion, our digestive fire, more than anything else, is stress. So if we are eating when we're in a stressed state, or we're eating in an environment that stresses us out, it's going to have a bad effect on our digestive fire. We can have the most perfect meal in the world that's been cooked absolutely immaculately. It is absolutely balanced, and it's seasonal and fresh and organic and wonderful and amazing and cooked with love. But if we eat it when we're really stressed, we're not going to be able to digest it well. So the most important thing when it comes to environment is making sure our mental environment is calm and peaceful, and making sure that the environment in which we're eating is as calm and peaceful as it can possibly be. Well, both of those environments are as calm and peaceful as they possibly can be. So if we're eating at work and our work environment stresses us out, then we need to remove ourselves from the environment. This isn't always possible, so at the very least we should turn around from our computer and not be eating while we're doing our emails or checking things. Stop, turn around from our computer, take at least 3 deep breaths, preferably 5, even better 10, to calm ourselves down before we eat. And in that time, we take in our food, we smell our food, we look at our food, we appreciate the textures of our food, and we get into the zone of, okay, I'm about to eat. And I want to eat feeling as calm and peaceful as I possibly can. At home, at work also, if we can, remove yourself from the environment. So get out of the office, walk down the street, preferably find the most peaceful little location you can nearby your work, maybe a little park, a garden, a courtyard, anything. Anything particularly with a little bit of nature, and eat your lunch there if you can, and that will have a huge impact on your digestion. When we're eating at home, if home is a stressful environment, particularly if the kids are running around being nuts or crazy or stressful in any way, or they're really intense little creatures at the dinner table, sometimes having a family meal together isn't the best idea for you. So sit down with them while they're eating, absolutely, have conversations, but if you find that to be a stressful environment, then eat your meal a little bit later on your own, eat it afterwards, because that's going to be much, much better for your digestive fire. Step number 8, the final thing to mention, is tastes, balancing our tastes. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, we have 6 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter and astringent. I won't go into much detail at all, except to say that when we go out to eat, and also in processed food, there tends to be an excess of certain tastes, particularly sweet, sour, salty and pungent. These are really common tastes that are really strong in restaurant food and processed food, which you would start to notice as you eat out less and you eat less processed food. You will notice when you go back and you go out for a meal, there'll be like these really punchy flavors, which are delicious as you're eating them, but afterwards they kind of linger in your palate, and often you feel a little bit weird, particularly if something's excessively sweet or excessively salty. You feel an effect on your body, or excessively pungent, like massive quantities of chili and that sort of thing. You feel an effect on your body. It's intense. What we want to work towards in Ayurveda is a much more subtle palate and a much more subtle expression of the 6 tastes, to the point where you have a balance of the 6 tastes. Now this is an art form. You're not going to get it straight away, but all I want to encourage you to do for now is just dial back the intensity of the tastes in your food a little bit, in your cooking, and start to notice when you have something that is really punchy in a certain flavour, how it makes you feel. Like you eat a packet of chips and they're incredibly salty, how does it make you feel? You'll start to notice that the tastes have an effect on the body, and we want to, if any food has a real excess of one taste, then it tends to be a little bit imbalanced. We want to have a combination of the 6 tastes, particularly in our savoury meals, and that will be much more balancing for our body mind and much more balancing for our digestive fire. In your cooking, when you're making a dish, if you taste it and it doesn't feel quite right, it's also usually because there's a lack of a certain taste, and often it's the salty taste or the sour taste. So a really wonderful way of just seasoning a meal at the end of cooking is to taste it, add a little bit more salt, and then add a little bit of sour. So maybe lemon juice or tamarind paste is often used as an addition of sour, but lemon juice is the most obvious one. In a savoury meal, obviously, you're not going to add lemon juice to your morning porridge. That can be a way of just subtly bringing the 6 tastes into balance. If you watch some of my cooking videos that I've sent to you, you will see that that's a common ending to cooking a meal in Ayurvedic cooking and nutrition. So that's quite a big video today. We had a lot to cover. In the next video, video 3 of the series, we will talk about some frequently asked questions and some common mistakes that are easy to make when you're first exploring this journey into Ayurvedic nutrition and cooking. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.